Just going to give it a couple minutes as the audience arrives. We've got a good turnout tonight, which is terrific. And then we'll get started. Which is a new role that I began in June, new position at Spring. Before that, I spent 35 years in independent schools, the last 15 as the Dean of College Advising at St. Paul's School in New Hampshire. I still live in New Hampshire and work remotely from here. And in this role with Spring, I have the great fortune of working with the outstanding college counselors and other school leaders at the Basis Independent Schools, Sagemont Prep, Stratford Prep, Laurel Springs School, and many others. And I have been so impressed with the commitment and the professionalism and knowledge of these great college counselors and school leaders. I've really enjoyed this work. And I'm also really excited to bring college admissions programming to students and parents across the network. And this is our first middle school program, but we thought it'd be a great idea to help families of middle schoolers start to think about college admissions, both from an informational and philosophical perspective. So we really hope that tonight you'll come away from this session both understanding the admissions landscape better, but also with food for thought as far as how you approach this process with your kids in healthy ways that are going to be both supportive and empowering for them. So we're going to get started, and we will have time for some live Q&A later in the hour. But I am really delighted to be joined this evening by an old friend, Brennan Barnard, who is one of the real experts in and most prolific writers about college admissions in the country. Brennan, in addition to serving as director of college counseling at the Conn Lab School, he's the college admissions program advisor with the Making Caring Common project at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and the director of college counseling for the College Guidance Network. Brennan has also served on the executive committee for the Character Collaborative and as a member of the advisory board for the New Hampshire College and University Council's New Hampshire Scholars Program. A contributing writer for Forbes.com, his thoughtful pieces on college admissions have also been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Examiner, the New York Times, the Concord Monitor, the Journal of College Admission, and many other publications. And particularly relevant to tonight's discussion, Brennan is co-author of a wonderful book called The Truth About College Admission, a family guide to getting in and staying together. And I would highly recommend this guide, and I will put a link to that in the chat shortly. But most importantly, Brennan is the father of Sam and Becca, two current college students whom I had the great privilege of supporting in my previous role as Dean of College Advising at St. Paul's. Brennan and I, as I mentioned, have been friends and colleagues for a long time, probably 25 years or so. And I can't think of a better person to partner with for a conversation about the current college admissions landscape and how middle school parents can begin to consider and approach this process in developmentally appropriate ways that affirm and empower their children. So Brennan, it is really great to have you here tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. It's great to be here. And we also live about 10 miles apart. And I do work at Conn Lab School, but I am remote as well. Conn Lab School is a mastery-based school out in Mountain View, California. So it's great to be here, Tim. Always great to see you.
Likewise. And yeah, so we're both here in central New Hampshire and hoping for some spring weather soon. So Brennan, we'll and by the way, this conversation, it will be really generally about college admissions, but we'll certainly try and focus it on what's important for families of middle schoolers to know. But thinking back, I mean, it's been a wild, certainly 5 years in college admissions, and some might say even longer than that. But in your career, what have been the trends that you've seen in admissions that and what changes have there been that are most most dramatic, most important for families to know, and where are we now? Where do you see that heading in the next 4 or 5 years?
Well, I mean, I like to say the only constant in college admission is change, right? And I mean, that said, there's a lot that stays the same, but it's a moving target in a lot of ways, and so that's why a lot of times, especially for middle school families, a lot of times I like to tell the families I work with that it's kind of a fool's errand to try to plan too far out, right? Try to anticipate what a college is going to want to see or what they're going to be looking for exactly when your student gets to apply to college. And so I like to think about it as kind of, be the best high school student, be the best middle school student you can be, and let that kind of lead to great outcomes in college admission, rather than try to predict the trends, I guess. That said, there are some trends, and I think one thing, especially for I think this is going to be good news for the people on this call, is that we are quickly approaching the demographic cliff. It's being called. And so the number of applicants, high school graduates and applicants to college is going to significantly decline in the next couple of years. 2025 is kind of the bubble. And so when unfortunately Tim and I did not benefit from that with our children, but it is only going to be easier to get into college. I'll say that, and it is the I think the take home message is that colleges want students, right? They need students, and they're going to want them even more. And so I think in the next couple of years, there's a lot we don't know. I mean, we don't know what the political climate is going to mean for college enrollment, what the international population is going to look like at colleges and universities. And so they're increasingly going to be leaning into domestic students and wanting to attract students and families. So I think that's a good trend. I think maybe we'll talk about testing later, but I think the testing landscape is always changing. There are changes in the ACT coming this year, and the SAT has recently changed with going digital, and a lot of schools are still I think it's 80% of all colleges in universities in the country are test optional. And there are some schools that have gone back to requiring tests, and they get the headlines, and they're kind of high profile, the most selective schools in the country. But the reality is that the majority of schools are still test optional. So those are a few to get us rolling. How about you?
Yeah.
Other
Yeah. And
things?
well, I think those are great. And I'm just struck by what you just said about, the few schools that get all of the headlines, and certainly around demographics and, even through COVID, all we would hear about is how, the volume of applications at the most selective schools continued to, rise at unprecedented rates. And that's true. But meanwhile, there were also many colleges that were really struggling with enrollment. And so, yeah, I think it's really important for parents to, as you're sort of working through all of the information that's in front of you, to recognize that the stories that are in the papers are mostly about a very, very small sliver of schools and don't represent the full landscape of colleges. And there are so many great schools out there, and great bargains to be had, both from an admissions perspective and from a financial perspective.
So I'd be curious, is the chat work? Can people enter things in the chat? I'd be interested from participants. If you had to guess, and don't Google it, if you had to guess what the number of schools, around the number of schools in this country that accept 25% or less of all applicants. So they only accept a quarter of applicants. What would you guess? Throw it in the chat.
Looks like we may not have the chat
Oh, so they keep
function. I don't see chat. I see Q&A, but not chat, unfortunately. So, but
chat.
in the Q&A, I'm seeing
The chat.
300, 0%. Can you see those, Brennan?
Yeah, no, the chat is live too. I'm
Oh,
looking.
okay. Oh,
So
you are. Okay. For
so
some
I'm
reason, I
seeing
can't
everything
see
from
that.
20 to 200. So the number is around 80. I mean, it's kind of a moving target, but about 80 colleges of the whatever it is, 2,400 four-year colleges in this nation, 80 colleges are oh, somebody got it right on. Um, is are accept less than a quarter of their applicants. And yet those are the schools, right, that we tend to like you're saying, we tend to focus on in the headlines. The reality is that the average acceptance rate for colleges and universities in this country is about 67%. So the majority of schools are taking over half of all applicants. So it's just, I think, good to kind of level set as we talk about this conversation.
I've also found it's really interesting having worked in New England. I think, where a lot of the families are tonight, a lot of the schools are in California, are in, DC, New York, many of the sort of areas where I think similarly sort of prestige focused populations around college admissions. It's not really representative of the entire country. I used to have a poster, you might remember this, Brennan, in my office from the old New Yorker cartoon of the New Yorker's view of the U.S. from Ninth Avenue, and the
Yeah.
Hudson River is where the Mississippi would be, and it's sort of about the provincialism of the Northeast, where we think that all the great schools are here. And we both have colleagues from other parts of the country who sort of chuckle at the fixation with the Ivy League or with certain schools, and they're real. I mean, most students in this country go to school. Most top students go to school, one, close to home, and two, where it's most affordable. Right. So the honors colleges at local state universities are really great options for top students as well. And that's not to in any way belittle the great education that you can get at some of the schools that do get sort of all of the attention. But there are really great options all over the place. And that's one thing to remember as you're working with your kids.
Yeah, what I find is really interesting, and a lot of times when my co-author Rick Clark, who's the director of admission at Georgia Tech, when we do presentations, a lot of times we'll put up a slide, and it's the first year class at Harvard Law School. So it's the of all the undergraduate institutions where the first year law students attended. And it's so amazing to see the breadth of colleges and universities where students are coming from. And so I think it's just a representation of kind of, it's not always where you go. Like you said, there's some great schools in those 80 schools, and there's some great schools in the next 100 schools after that. But I think we get a little caught up on just kind of an uber focus on outcome based on reputation. So, so
All right. Well,
I think that's going to shift, and I guess another trend I would say is I I think it's starting now, and we're going to see it even more, which is there not being one path to college, right?
mhm.
A lot of schools are starting to lean into fall enrollment in London or in abroad, or Northeastern has a campus in California, and they'll start students in California, and then I mean, my son started college in February. And it was the best thing that ever happened to him. He worked at a farm in the fall and had a great experience and made some money and had some time off before he started college. And I think there's going to be a trend to we already see it with kind of credentialing and things like that, that the idea of a 4-year college experience at one college, that's still going to be a thing, but it's not that linear and not that fixed. And so I think that's just another trend we're going to see more and more in the coming years.
Yeah. One thing I just want to turn back to before we get into, all of this said, we'll certainly want to get into some of the practical, the process of what are colleges looking for, more about testing that you mentioned. But to your point about doing high school well, I think, one of the mistakes that I see families make often is trying to reverse engineer the process and approaching it from the perspective of, how do we get into school X? And I would always turn that back and say, well, so what are the characteristics or the qualities of school X that are, so appealing, and trying to really unpack that, but also to trust that if you approach high school the right way, and you're curious and you're engaged and you try different things and you explore, that path will lead you to a group of schools that will match you really well. Because as you said, things are changing, and college admissions changes. And if you think that you can line it up to put yourself in the best position, and in 4 years, it may be a different landscape, and it may have backfired. And then where are you? So really doing high school well is the most important thing.
Well, and the reality is, mission drives admission, right? Mission drives admission at any college. Their mission and their institutional priorities will drive how they structure their admission process. So we don't know now what the institutional priorities will be at UCLA or at Bowdoin College, or we don't know what those are going to be in 5 years. And so, like you said, just kind of lean into what you love and let that drive kind of where you go. And I think the question I hear the most when I do presentations is how can my child stand out, right?
Right.
How can they stand out? And they can stand out by being the best of who they are, right? Because the reality is, many of the most selective schools could accept a full class of students and throw that class out and accept another full class of students, and it would look very much similar to that in terms of statistics and all that kind of stuff. So,
Right. So in terms of standing out, I mean, let's look at the sort of the selection process, the review process, and you have a background in college admissions as well. But how are colleges evaluating candidates? Can you just sort of talk through the different components of that, from most important to maybe
yeah.
secondary?
Yeah, and it's interesting because our professional association, the National Association for College Admission Counseling, does a survey every year on the state of admission, and they ask college admission officers what to rank what the most important aspects of a application are, and always first are academic achievement, academic achievement, and the courses, the rigor of the courses, how a student does in school, right? Because they want to know that a student can be successful on their campus, and they want to know that a student has challenged themselves and done well. After that, it's kind of pretty close in terms of how they spend their time, how they're involved in their community. A student's character is high on that list. If a school requires testing, that is up there, but actually below college essay and recommendations and all that kind of stuff. It'd be interesting for families to know, especially at your schools, that the recommendation from high school counselors and teachers are pretty high on that list. And that's the benefit of being at a school like the schools that you listed at the outset that are in the spring education group. And because you have counselors who know you well, you have teachers who know you well and can write compelling letters about who you are in the classroom, who you are academically, and who you are as a community member. And so I think that's a real benefit for being at a school like this. So that's high on the list. Again, kind of background and context of what you've done in high school and how you've taken advantage of opportunities. Those are all big pieces.
Yeah,
Right.
that's great. I think I remember, Deb Johns when she was at Yale would talk in information sessions about the two fundamental questions that they would be asking as they read. And one was, to your point, uh, how is this student going to take advantage of the resources available to them here? So, how curious are they? Obviously the academic performance is a given at that point. It's an expectation that it's going to be a really strong academic student. But how are they going to take advantage of the opportunities and resources here? And then how are they going to impact the experience of others in the classroom around campus? And so those are really general questions, but those are sort of what drives the way that really selective schools think.
Yeah, and another question they ask, and I love the way this kind of you can think about this. It's will this student be missed, or how
Mm,
will this student be missed? Like when they leave high school, how will they be missed? And when they leave college, how will our campus miss them? And that speaks a lot. I mean, that's the impact piece you're talking about, but
yeah.
I think it's a interesting way for families to think about kind of the things they do.
So this will roll into maybe sort of course selection, and you mentioned the importance of the academic piece, but I think one bit of advice that I would have for families is that more does not always mean better, right? And you talked about context, which is certainly the most important word in college admissions. What has a student had access to? How have they challenged themselves within what they
Right.
have available to them? But even that, the choices that you make in selecting courses, the choices you make, and as you said, in how you spend your time, which is another nice general way of thinking of extracurriculars, leadership. What are those choices that you make? It doesn't always mean that more APs makes you a more compelling candidate, but certainly you want to challenge yourself within what's available to you. So, what are your thoughts on that in terms of how much is too much or how to think about those things?
Yeah, yeah. Um, the what I've been saying lately, which I kind of I like this framing, is you should stretch but not stress.
Hmm.
Stretch but not stress. So if you think of kind of concentric circles, I mean you have your comfort zone, right? And then expanding out of that, you have kind of your stretch zone, and then expanding beyond that, you have your stress zone. And so you should really be living in that stretch zone, right? Like challenging yourselves. You should kind of bend but not break, if you will. And so again, yeah, it is not healthy to take so many advanced level courses, whether those are APs or other advanced level courses, that you're not getting enough sleep and you're not able to spend your time doing other things. It's not healthy to spend every Saturday trying to get your test scores up at the expense of being able to do other meaningful things in your life. And so if you can but it's also not healthy just always staying in your comfort zone and not challenging yourself. And so I think that can be a helpful way for people to think about it. And in terms of the less is more, or more is not always better piece of things. I mean, MIT, for example, as you know, they limit the number of things activities you can share on the application. So they limit it to four activities you can share, and I think that's signaling the fact that it's not about this laundry list or this resume of what you've done. It's about kind of how meaningfully you've engaged. And I I like the have you read? I don't know if you've read. Have you read the David Brooks, The Road to Character? Um,
Yeah.
he he in that, as you know, he talks about resume virtues versus eulogy virtues.
Right.
And I think that's a good framing for families as they think about these next couple years, right? Instead of trying to build this resume, try to build these virtues around kind of the eulogy virtues, like who do you want to be, and what do you want to contribute to a community, and think of it that way rather than kind of how can I just show what I've done.
Right. Oh, that's great. I'm reminded of, and I tell this story often. You've probably heard it, but the best interview question that I have ever heard was, "Why do you do what you do?" And again, it comes back. It's not what do you do. Tell me about what you do. It's not the resume,
Yeah.
but it's like, what are the things that compel you, to participate in whatever you're doing, academically or otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's actually a good way of thinking too about course planning, right? So whenever I would have a student who might come and say, Mr. Pratt, should I take, AP chemistry? That conversation was never in the silo of just AP chemistry. It's like, well, let's look at your entire program. Let's
Yeah.
look at what else you're doing. What would that come at the expense of, or what would, are you really excited about that course? And also, importantly, this is not to, again, to shortchange rigor at all. Like, it's really important to challenge yourself in high school appropriately. And so it's not sort of you know, a shortcut to, doing less, but just being thoughtful about the choices that you make.
Yeah, and it comes back to I mean, the question I hope that every student and family will ask at the outset of this experience is why, right? Right? Like, why are you? I mean, I think that's something that's important for students to think about as they get into high school. Like, why do I want to go to college? Right? And that answer is going to change over time, but I think asking that question a lot, and then you apply that to everything you do. Like, if that advanced chemistry, why do I want to take advanced chemistry? Is it just to stand out to colleges? And maybe that's a good enough reason. But what's the end game?
Brennan, I loved your recent piece. In fact, I added it to the counselor resource library we have for the spring college counselors, on the hierarchy of questions. And so parents, that was in Forbes? Am I
Yeah.
correct that yeah. Great one to read. And it's exactly what we're talking about, of sort of too often we jump to where before we ask the really seminal questions, and why should be the first and most important. And you'll get to the where, if you follow through that hierarchy of questions. I mentioned, Brennan, too, that I don't have access to the chat, so would
Oh,
love it
yeah.
if you could put the link to your book in there. That would be terrific.
I do have access to the chat, and I'm actually gonna put that link to that Forbes piece in there now too.
Great. Okay. Terrific. While you're doing that, so testing, we touched briefly on testing and the test optional environment. Um, and, obviously there were, a great many really good schools that were test optional before COVID, but coming out of COVID, well, certainly through COVID, nearly every school went test optional, out of necessity. And, the plan was to sort of assess the data, see how it impacted their incoming classes. And, what we've seen, as you mentioned, is that, some schools, and certainly some at the most selective end, have gone back to requiring testing. But many, many more have remained test optional. And I think what I've always said, when asked, is I think we're going to see schools go back to standardized testing, but I don't think the testing landscape will ever be the same. What are your thoughts on sort of the role of testing,
Yeah.
both at schools that do require it, and then also in sort of this uh, ambiguous test optional landscape, or arena, where, like, what does that really mean? A lot of parents want to know.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say at the outset, if a school is test optional, it means they're really test optional, right? It means they have decided, for their process in this moment, testing is not a key factor. If you have high testing at most schools, if you have high testing and that's above their accepted student range, then you should send it, because it's just another way of demonstrating some level of mastery or some level of achievement. So it doesn't hurt to send. As you might know, I mean, I know you know, Tim, but as folks might know, the UC system doesn't accept tests at all, right? So they're test free. So even if you have strong testing, you can't send it. And in fact, some students, I just learned this recently. Some students with high testing, every once in a while, try to get the admission office there to see it. So they'll put it in their essay or something, So, and then when I got a 1600 on the SAT, but they actually have people to go in and scrub that from the application. So um, so but for the schools that are test optional, it really does mean that they are saying if you choose not to send that, we're going to focus on the other areas of your application, right? We're gonna look at your other strengths and let that speak for itself. Um, I I think if there are some highly selective schools, and there are some state systems that require it. So if you're looking at schools in Florida and Georgia, right, you need to have testing. And so my recommendation is that everyone take the tests and see if they can do well, but then at some point decide, either um, this is something I want to engage in and do some test prep and try to bring up my scores because they're just close enough to some of the schools I'm looking at and their average that if I could do a little better, that might help me. Great. But then again, as we said earlier, it's kind of a trade-off, right? The time you spend doing test prep, is that taking time away from other meaningful things you could be doing that might be more impactful in your college admission process. So I would say as students get there, if they're trying to decide to apply test optional or not, they should just look at the school's average of accepted students. And then if they're at the high end of that average or over that average, they should submit testing. And if not, don't.
Another example too of where it's really great to be at schools with robust college counseling programs because as you've seen, I know, Brennan, that those averages because of test optional have gone up, that conventional wisdom has sort of shifted a little bit too, right? It used to be over the 75th percentile, definitely submit, but at some places now the 75th percentile is, it might be 1560
Yeah.
because only students with strong testing are submitting. So, again, we'll see where that is in a few years. But the other piece of testing that I would say is, for strong testers, I've seen students who feel like I've got a 1560, and I'm going to take it again to see if I can get a 1600 or and testing is there. It's not a magic bullet by any means. And I remember actually, if there are parents from Stratford Prep in San Jose here, a couple of weeks ago, I did a program out there with Gary Clark and used this example of Dan Warner when he was at Stanford. He did a program for parents for me, and the question of the role of testing came up, and he said, at Stanford in committee, we never talk about testing. And again, it's sort of that threshold, right? Like you're a strong tester, that's great, but it's not, the difference between a 1560 and a 1600 is not the difference in getting into Stanford. It's more, what are those other pieces that you're bringing to the table? So, and the beauty of test optional that I've seen is that student is not a strong tester. I agree with you. Everybody should take it at least once. But now if it doesn't look like it's going to be an area of strength, you don't have to spend your summers, right, doing test prep. You can focus on our other areas of strength, and that has, I think, alleviated a lot of pressure on kids, which is terrific.
At some point, it just becomes an exercise of frustration.
Right. So any other, we've talked a little bit about, mistakes we've seen families make. Any other sort of bits of advice or mistakes that you've seen kids and families make in approaching the process early on? Again, not so much in applying, but in thinking about it in the early years.
Well, so a couple things. I would say one mistake is starting too early. I mean, it's good to plan ahead, but to to make every conversation in as you get into high school, especially to make every conversation about college really sells short the high school experience. And yes, you're at college preparatory schools, and you're choosing to be at schools that have great outcomes and all of that. And so I would say trust the process, and and plan thoughtfully, but don't make everything turn into how is this going to look for college, and don't fixate on the college process because you know when you look back at your high school experience after 4 years, and you might get into the school you really want to get into, and you might not. Do you want to look back on that experience and say, wow, I wasted all that time fixating on this one college and I didn't get in there anyway? Or I spent all this time kind of focused on a college, but now my interests have changed, right? And so I think it's good to have these conversations. I definitely think it's good to have conversations about money as a family early. So um, so what role are finances and other things like that going to play in eventual college decisions and where a student can look and go. But don't let this experience kind of rule your world.
It's good advice for sure. So there are some questions starting to come in, and parents, if you'd like to put any other questions in the Q&A, please do. There's one here that's interesting, and as far as school group context, the question is, are students competing against each other students from the same school? What does that look like? And again, that word context comes up. So what are your thoughts on that, Brennan?
Yeah, are they against their classmates, essentially, you're saying?
Yeah, against their classmates or from the same geographic region, versus competing against the entire. And it's interesting the use of the word competing, right? But are they evaluated against, relative to their classmates,
Yeah.
versus the overall pool, and maybe what role does, geographic region play in
Yeah,
admissions?
so I will say, so they're not comparing a student from one school to a student from another school. So they're not looking at a student from my school, from Lab school, and comparing that student kind of directly with a student from Nueva or another school in in San Jose, or they're looking at, again, that student in the context of what they've had available to them and the courses they've had available to them at that high school. Like, so Lab school doesn't have AP courses, right? And so they're not expecting our school students from our school to have APs, whereas a student down the road might have 15 APs or something like that. And so they're not comparing those. They are looking at geographic region when they're looking at applicants, because schools want to diversify where their students are coming from. And so there are some regions of the country where it's harder to get into certain schools. So if you're in Silicon Valley, it's going to be hard to get into Stanford, harder than it is maybe if you live in Oklahoma. That's just the reality of the numbers of students who are applying. They are not they're not looking at school groups in a way that is kind of zero sum, and they're looking at kids are not competing for a spot from that school.
Yeah, that's great. And I think what you said about the context of what's available at the school is really important in understanding that. I think the other way I've talked about this with kids, because you're right. I mean, there's no quota in how many kids Stanford is going to take from, basis Silicon Valley or from Con or, from Nueva or from wherever. Um, What is true though is that they can see, and I don't know about at Con Lab, but at Basis there's no rank, right? So they may not have a rank, but when there are a lot of students from one school applying, they can see the context of performance in that school group, right? And so it's another reason sometimes it's great to spread out and not be part of a really large school group applying to a school. But if they have, if they see, five applicants in a given year that they, think would be great additions uh, to their school, they're going to take five. And in another year, might not be any. So there aren't quotas. And I think what you said about geography is really true. But important also parents to know that that's like not one of the primary considerations, as Brennan was talking about, sort of that survey of colleges and what are the most important things. Like geography would be way down the list of things that are impacting admissions.
Just for folks who are tuning in, Tim can't see the webinar chat, so if you're putting questions, use the Q&A, please. I see some people putting questions in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A so he can take those.
And if there's any you see, Brennan, that you want to answer, it'd be great. One topic that came up here too that I know we've had a lot of conversations about, and you're really interested in, is the role or the impact of AI on the admissions process, and maybe the review of essays. How do they know what's genuine, what's not? And
yeah, all the majority of colleges and universities I've talked to, pretty much to a T, they're not using AI to make college admission decisions. So you can rest assured they're not doing that. Some are using it to kind of organize the process and to kind of to collate things and to figure out what the highest course on a transcript might be and things like that. So they're experimenting with some of that stuff, but they are not using AI to make decisions. So no worries there. And they are not, very few colleges are using AI detection software on essays because there's so many false positives that those tools have been shown to be really ineffective. I'd heard about students who were writing essays and were intentionally putting mistakes in their essay because they didn't want colleges to think AI had written it. And so don't get caught up in the mind tricks. So I wouldn't worry about the role of AI. I think AI from the student perspective can be a really great tool. The students can use it to kind of hone their search, right? They can use it to compare colleges. They can use it to get really specific information. Like, so let's use my daughter as an example, Tim, right? Because you worked with her. She wanted to row crew, and she wants to study exercise science, and she wants, she has all these criteria, and she wanted to be in a certain region. And you can go pretty easily into ChatGPT and put that in there and get a good list, a starting list, right? And there's some things that we as counselors might not even know if there's specific things like which colleges have an animal behavior lab, right? Like that's not something I as a counselor just know, but there's some interesting uses for AI with that. And then also just as a kind of a thought partner to brainstorm essay topics. I think obviously never use it to write your essay, but I think there's good uses for it there. And then for parents,
and I think,
yeah.
Hey, go ahead. Do you want to talk about parent GPS?
Yeah, I was just going to say for parents, there's lots of tools, and like the College Guidance Network that I work with has developed this free parent GPS app that is trained by people like Tim and other experts in college admission, and so it's kind of has guardrails. It's not going out to large language models, which are trained on Reddit and all kinds of things, but it is trained on experts, and it gives it's a chatbot that AI counseling assistant. So it's pretty cool.
So there's another question here that maybe I'll take a stab at. That's a really good one about, the role that parents have in and the term passion, which I think is one of the most overused terms in college admissions, because nobody uh, should really expect, or does really expect, that teenagers are necessarily going to have found their passion. But how do you help kids find their interests, find their passion? Or do parents of middle schoolers play a bigger role in this? And my advice as a parent, and having worked in college counseling for 25 years, is the best thing you can do as a parent is provide lots of opportunities for your kids to explore and try different things, not to shoehorn them into something, um, partly because they may burn out. It may not be something that they're really excited about. And as Brennan was saying earlier, you don't know if that's going to be the pathway that's going to help them get into college. And best thing to do is to help them and give them opportunities to really explore and learn and find what is exciting to them. Um, any
Yeah,
other thoughts you have on that?
yeah, I mean, it's a big thing right now. Everybody's talking about passion projects. Like, I need to have a
Mm-hmm.
passion project. And there's tons of companies that are sprouting up all over the country who will, if you pay them a couple $1,000s in the summer, they'll help you develop a passion project and carry out a passion project or carry out research. And I would not buy into that. Definitely don't pay money for it. But colleges and university admission officers can see right through that, and they can see when a student is doing something with to impress them, or because they think it's going to help them in admission. I would say, like you said, just follow your interests. If there's things that you love, try to take them to the next level. Like, don't go out trying to find something, but just lean into the things that really excite you.
Interesting question here too about really, well, it starts with sort of talk about private schools versus public schools and getting into highly selective colleges. Um, the role that the high school plays. Does it play a role? How do colleges look at different high schools? And Brennan, before letting you answer this, I'm reminded by a conversation when Jim Miller was at Brown. He answered this question by saying, "We admit students, not schools." And I think that is an important framing for parents to know, that it really is true that they're, as Brennan said, they're looking at students in the context of what's available to them. They're certainly interested in enrolling students from a diverse set of schools, and that's, I think, increasingly the case. But what role would you say that where you go to high school does play, and does it matter?
Well, again, I think I mean, it comes back to this. It's what you do with the opportunities you have, and I think, the schools that students attend, that whose parents are on this tonight, um, provide a lot of opportunities for growth. And so I think that's the way it should be looked at. So it's not that the school name is exactly going to get the student into a college, or that the college counselor is going to pick up the phone and say, "Oh, you should take this student." And it is the fact that they're coming from schools that are well regarded, and the academic program is well regarded, and that they've had opportunities to challenge themselves, and they have opportunities to grow, and they have opportunities to be young people of character. And I think that's what makes them stand out. So again, yes, they're accepting those students. Having the opportunities of being at schools like these is really amazing. And so they're not shutting out private schools or focusing on certain schools. So
Yeah. Um, there have been a couple questions from, I think, from Laurel Springs parents of the online
yeah.
high school, and how can counselors and teachers know you well enough to write genuine references? And I just want to say to the Laurel Springs parents that I have had an opportunity to work closely with Alyssa Landreth and Heidi McClure and their entire team. And maybe one of the things that I've been most pleasantly surprised with, not having worked with online schools before, is how strong the college counseling program is. And so, as at a brick and mortar school, the most important thing, if you want your teachers or counselors to write good letters of recommendation for you, is to engage with them and help them to get to know you so that they can do that. And I think that's another mistake sometimes kids make, is that they don't work hard enough to share with their counselors.
Yeah, I mean, it's no different from me. I live in New Hampshire. My school's in California, right? I mean,
Yeah.
essentially, it is online that way. And I've also worked, as you know, for an online school for elite athletes, and and got to know students really well. I currently work for a school in Georgia called the Forest School, which has an online school, and we get to know the students, and as do the Laurel Springs folks, and so they can share all the wonderful things about them.
There's another interesting question. When will colleges start using videos instead of essays? And actually the answer is not instead of essays necessarily, but they have already. Many have already started to use videos. Can you talk about that? I think
Yeah.
it's largely they've replaced interviews at some places.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. So some schools have been piloting it over the last couple of years. I mean, like Bowdoin was doing it for years, and Brown now does it, and some other schools where you can they allow students to submit kind of 2-minute videos in addition to their essays and things like that. There's also a program called Initial View, which is what I think what you're talking about, which is videos that replace the interview. And they have a thing called Glimpse that Duke is using, and a bunch of other schools are using, Chicago, and so it does exist. And I think what the person who's asking, I don't see where the question is, but I think the question is, when will it replace essays? And there's some people who predict that, that's the way things are going to move, that, with AI and all this other stuff, that the essay is going to become somewhat obsolete, and that perhaps that interviews will videos will kind of replace those. So to be
Yeah, I
determined.
think that yeah, we hadn't really touched on that in the AI conversation, but there's another question here of why colleges need essays, but not in-person interviews. And I think the reality is that that's just the nature of volume, right? Interviews have largely gone by the wayside because the volume of applications has just grown to such a degree that they can't do it. I think college admissions folks, if they were able to get the kind of information they could from an interview, would love to do that. It's just a human power issue.
And
Here's one. Go ahead, Brennan.
there's a question here about, do you have a list of all college admission resources? And I would
Oh,
just say your counselors have great resources. So I would just reach out to them, and they can provide you a whole bunch of different options.
yeah, there are a lot of really good ones out there. Some great books, great guides. What I would say, another mistake, I would steer clear of things like College Confidential. The most dangerous phrase, I think, in college admissions or parenting around college admissions is "I heard that." Anything that begins with that sort of "I heard that" becomes something that might be, one example, but it doesn't necessarily speak to to any sort of generalization. Um, so the question here that I'm really glad somebody is posing: when choosing between a prestigious, broad-focused university like an Ivy League and a specialized program such as Carnegie Mellon for computer science, what factors should students prioritize to align with their academic career and personal goals? Could the panel share examples of when a student might lean toward one type of school over the other, and or strategies to balance prestige, specialization, and fit? Interesting example, I guess, there to use between Carnegie Mellon computer science and the Ivy Leagues too, right?
Yeah, because Carnegie Mellon is a prestigious school that is well known, especially for computer science. And so I would kind of throw them in the same bucket in a lot of ways. But I mean, I think the question is also about how focused do you lean into just one area, right? And how much do you allow your search to be driven by the your intended major or your intended career? Um, and that's a really personal choice. And I mean, the reality is that I think something like two-thirds of all students change their major at least once, and many multiple times. And so um, I think it's all right to focus on a certain program like computer science at a specific school, but also making sure there are other options there that are exciting to you that can also be a good fit.
Yeah, and I think, one of the most valuable messages I remember hearing once is that the difference between schools is far less often than the difference within schools. So, for example, if you want to study engineering, Purdue is, as good an option as any. I mean, it's a fantastic engineering school. If you want to study French, and I don't know actually much about the Purdue French program, so it's not fair for me to maybe use them as an example. But your search might look really different if you want to study the liberal arts or French, rather than computer science or engineering. And it is actually really important for families to know, like, there are different levels of selectivity within universities too. So computer science is probably the hardest major right now to be admitted to. And certainly, as Brennan said, at a Carnegie Mellon, probably as difficult to get into as MIT for computer science. And so even the rates of admission can differ within universities.
And it's the same thing at Carnegie Mellon with their musical theater program.
Right.
Right. They have a superb musical theater program that takes very few students every year, and it's just the acceptance rate is in the single digits.
Yeah. And I think, what you said about people changing majors, an example, I'll use an example actually of one of my own kids who went to college thinking he was going to be a French major. He had studied abroad in high school. He took some psychology classes in college and fell in love with it. And he's starting a PhD program in social psychology in the fall. And I've always said, where you go to college matters, but it matters in ways that you really can't anticipate, not the ways that you think it will. Where is going to be that professor who really sparks an interest that you have, and that's the exciting possibility of what can happen when you're in college.
Absolutely.
Great. I think we have time, maybe, Brennan, for one more. I don't know if you're seeing any that.
See.
Oh, how about this? So here's an interesting one about research opportunities at liberal arts colleges versus big research universities. That's an interesting topic too. What are your thoughts on research at liberal arts versus universities? Are there comparable research opportunities at liberal arts colleges or at research universities?
That's a great question, and like everything within college admission, it depends, is the answer. But oftentimes, they're actually at small liberal arts colleges and smaller colleges, there can be even more research opportunities for undergraduates, right? At some big universities, oftentimes the research opportunities are reserved for graduate students or for students as they get into the upper levels in junior, senior year. And often smaller schools, you can start working on research opportunities with professors as a first year student. Some schools, they have a thesis program, like I'm thinking Reed College in Oregon, for example, or some schools like that the research or WPI, where research is built into their program. I think you need to really understand within the certain discipline that you're looking at, what opportunities exist at those schools, and go and ask, look and see what kind of research professors are doing and who's involved in that research. And go when you visit colleges, go to the department and look at the posters on the wall that they post from conferences and things like that students are doing, and see what class year they are, and ask questions. I think that's the take home with this. Just don't be afraid to ask, because you want to be a good consumer.
Yeah. Well, that's a great final thought, I think parents, that as you think about this process, which is several years away for you, but will come quickly. My final thought is there's a question here too of sort of when is the right grade for a student to determine their interest and passion. And I think what Brennan and I have both been trying to impress upon you is that in a lot of ways, passion isn't something you get to determine. It's something that you discover, and that happens at different ages for different kids. And I think parents can sometimes push too hard toward certain passions, and that can backfire. So, helping your student to explore, to be curious, to be a good citizen. Again, those eulogy virtues that Brennan mentioned from David Brooks. Those are going to pay off when college admissions time comes around, and in terms of finding really good fit schools. Brennan, any final thoughts that you would have?
No, I would just say, I'll leave you with a quote, and it's Tom Kubis, who's an American jazz musician. You don't have to do this; you get to do this, right? You are at great schools with amazing support, as Tim said at the beginning, from your counselor, but also from Tim, and kind of at the overarching level. And this is a real opportunity and a privilege, and this is something you get to do. It's not something you have to do. So embrace the time as a family, enjoy the time as a family. It can be a great time to build memories, and enjoy the ride.
Well, and Brennan, this has been something I've been fortunate to be able to get to do with you this evening, and I really appreciate your time. And thanks so much for being here. And parents, best of luck to you and to your kids in this exciting venture.
Absolutely. Have a great night.